Sasha Thompson is a respected and certified DEI coach. For the next 30 minutes, we'll get an exclusive look at some of her conversations with others in the field. Welcome to DEI After 5.
Hello and welcome to DEI After 5. I am really looking forward to this conversation because probably about a year ago, I was moderating a panel and this particular guest was on, and everything that she said was just like a golden nugget for me. And so when we were planning for this show, I knew that I had to have her on here. So today's guest is Janet Stovall. She is a TEDx speaker. She is a diversity pragmatist. She is just amazing. And so welcome, Janet.
Welcome. Thank you for having me. Glad to be here. Looking forward to
Thank
this.
you. Yes. So for those that may not know much about you, which I don't know how they can, talk to us a little bit about, how you got into diversity and inclusion work.
Well, actually, by all practical purposes, I was born into it. I mean, it's hard to be who I am and not be in the space. But in terms of moving into it in the corporate space, I'd be lying if I told you that there was a steady path. I am primarily a communicator. My work in marketing and communications, I ran my own consulting firm for 21 years. And then when I decided to go back to the dark side and go back into corporate, I like stock options. So I did. And I went to work for UPS and was a speechwriter for the CEO of UPS. That position in a company that size, over 500,000 employees around the world, gives you a little air cover to do some things. So by the time I went back into corporate America in 2017, and had worked with companies and CEOs for 21 years, sort of individually, that position allowed me to start doing the work that I thought was important. And I had the support of a CEO who would let me do it. So I kind of cut my teeth in the DEI space, in the corporate space, in a company that size at UPS. So I started doing work there. I helped build the Equity, Justice, and Action Task Force. I helped that CEO envision his DEI journey in many ways. And so from there, I just kind of kept staying and doing it. And now I'm at the Neuro Leadership Institute and I'm part of the consulting team there. I am also on the keynote team. So I do education and delivery. And as part of the consulting team, I actually build DEI journeys for companies, Fortune 100 companies all over the world.
I'm trying to figure out where I want to go next with this because you said so many things that I want to tap into. But no, I think it's great. And I think one of the things that really drew me to you was that your background was in marketing and communications as well.
Exactly.
Right. So I did it in marketing. And for so many people, they feel the only way to get into diversity and inclusion is through HR. And, when you and I spoke, we talked about it, even a lot of your posts talk about the importance of communications and the importance of being able to do that internally and externally. And how do you make sure that your diversity and inclusion is authentic and accurate and not just window dressing?
Absolutely.
Right?
I mean, the thing is if you think about what a normal, if there's such a thing, because I don't think it's cookie cutter, but a commonplace DEI strategy in a company is, it may sound self-serving to say this, but I believe 85 to 95% of it is communications. It is how people communicate, how leaders create a vision, communicate that to their direct reports, who then have to communicate that down the organizational org chart, how you communicate to employees, how you communicate about what you're doing as an organization to the outside world, how leaders within an organization communicate ideally with each other to make sure that DEI doesn't get siloed with a chief diversity officer or doesn't get siloed in HR. If you want it to spread around the organization, it's all about communication. I mean, you hire people to build programs and they do amazing jobs of that. You hire people to build metric systems for you. They do amazing jobs of that. But the communication is something that has to happen all the time, everywhere. So I'm a firm believer that some of the best chief diversity officers probably should be former communicators, or they're never former, but communicators. I mean, how often do you take somebody who came out of that space and move them into a chief diversity role. You don't often. I'm actually doing a project right now for myself personally, where I'm looking at I'm looking very much at the diversity officers that are in the Fortune 100, and I'm tracing sort of figure out what their backgrounds are. I don't
Mm,
see too many who came out of comms. Most came out of
no,
HR or legal.
right. Which then that's a whole other conversation for me. Because then I think it's, focused on compliance
Absolutely.
versus communication and understanding and learning, right? Which
Exactly.
is a whole other ball of wax. One of the things that we talked about when we did the webinar, gosh, it's almost been a year.
Wow.
I know it's almost been a year, is how this work is just interdisciplinary. And we were having this conversation about where colleges and universities right now could just create the new normal and what DEI is and create this interdisciplinary um, offering, right? If it's a degree, if it's a master's or PhD, or even an undergraduate degree in
Hmm.
diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what would that look like? Um, and so you had shared some thoughts there that I think would be important for people to think about, because again, so many folks are tied to DEI being in HR, but there's so much more to it.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about what you have to understand to be effective in DEI, that's partially why it's sort of the wild, wild west out there right now, because people are trying to define it, and it's good in a way that people are interested. It's sad why. I mean, let's face it. This kicked into high gear 2 years ago with the murder of
Mm-hmm.
George Floyd. All of a sudden now, companies are very interested looking at it, especially from a racial standpoint. But on the one hand, that newfound attention is great because now we're getting some traction in the space. On the other hand, it means there's a whole lot of snake oil that's getting sold in the
Mm,
business. And what could help that would be for the academy to develop a body of knowledge and standardize it and teach, just like we do anything else. But what's going to be required is in business schools, you can't teach DEI as a straight business function. You just cannot.
mm-hmm.
That should be part of it. People should understand why companies care about doing this and what the effect should be. But you also got to have some background in sociology. You got to have some background in history, which is why everybody's mad about, well, some folks are mad about
Yeah.
CRT right now because they know that despite the fact that that's not what is being taught, they don't want history taught because history is
Mm-hmm.
powerful. History tells us how we got where we are right now.
Mm-hmm.
And you understand that we didn't just suddenly get to the place that we are. And it's not a function of people's moral failings, it is a system. And
Mm-hmm.
so we don't want history taught, some of us, because then we got to accept that the system is what got us here. But you got to know that. So if you're going to be in the DEI space, you need to know that. And what has happened is that those of us who are in this space, most of us who are here now, sort of the people who are doing the work, a lot of us are in it because we have a passion for it, because we naturally had an interest or an affinity to some of these areas of expertise. We either came out of sociology or
Mm-hmm.
communications, and we have a natural interest in history and how things are put together. We want to paint that big picture, but there's no way that we can standardize that and make it. And there's some certification programs coming out there. Some of them are pretty good. I've done two. I did
Mm-hmm.
one through Yale and one through Cornell, and Georgetown has one, and they're coming out, but they're certification programs. I'd love
Right.
to see somebody be able to get a degree in this, to give it 4 years or more of extended study and put the real world experience into it, because you can get pieces of it. You can get psych, social, whatever, but where's the best practice going to come from if we don't do it that way?
Yeah.
And
And I
so
think
yeah.
that's the one I was just like, yes, because my background's in sociology, right? But I loved my anthropology. I loved history. I love
Hmm.
putting all of these things together to understand how we how do we get here,
Hmm.
right? And it's so important, as you said, and so many people
Because if
want
we
to
don't know
say,
how we got here, we don't know
how
how
do we
we're
know
going
where
to get
we're
away
going?
from this. We
Right.
don't know where
Well,
we're going.
there's no path. There's
There's no
absolutely
path.
no path.
Right.
Um, and so I think that's a critical piece of this work. It's not, let's just pick up from where we are today, because we need to understand what shaped how we got to this point so that we can now know what systems we need to dismantle or what programs or whatever it is to counterbalance what's been put
Absolutely.
in place. So I
Absolutely.
think that that's, yes, go ahead.
And to see how all the systems are interconnected, because we think about sort of what systemic inequity is. And I focus a
Hmm.
lot on racism because I think that's the big rock we got to move. I think if we move that rock, the smaller rocks
Hmm.
will follow. But so if you think about just one type of systemic inequity, you think about racism. Systemic is not the same thing as systematic.
Right.
Systematic inequity or racism is about the laws, the things we see on the books, the things we can point to. And for the most part, that's not here anymore. And a lot of
Hmm.
people think that because you don't have laws on the books anymore that tell people they can discriminate legally, that all right, we're fine, we're post-racial, we're this, we had a black president. No,
Hmm.
because what happens is the legacy of that systematic racism is a systemic racism. The laws around housing, the laws around what could be done to bodies of color medically in healthcare, the laws
Hmm.
around what we did in education and who could get an education and who couldn't, the laws around, heaven forbid, the laws in the legal sphere, judicial laws. Those things may be gone now, but their legacy is there, and they built a system. So if we don't understand that this stuff is systemic, we walk around and we're surprised. We look at people and
Hmm.
individuals and we try to put the blame on it. So if you're not wearing a hood, then you can't be racist. The bottom line is if you live in a racist society, it's like being a fish in water. You're surrounded by it. It's part of who you
Yep.
breathe it every day. You live in it. And the book How to Be an Anti-Racist, one of the things I think that's most powerful in that is he says, you can't, if you're not actively being anti-racist, you
Hmm.
are being racist. And I
Yep.
wish we had another word that weren't so triggering, but we don't yet. Not yet. We communicators haven't figured out what should be yet. But so the bottom line is you have to be actively working against it. And you can't understand that unless you understand it's the system, it's the air we breathe, it's the water we swim in. And if you don't look at it that way, if you think it's somehow outside of you or it was in the
Hmm.
past, whatever, if you don't have that kind of comprehensive view, you don't work to fix it. You can't.
Yeah. And I think that's a lot of what's happening in a lot of these companies right now is they're looking at, okay, in this moment in our organization, we don't have these rules, regulations to discriminate. So we're all good until people that are marginalized speak up and say, no, right? Not how
Right.
I'm treated. When you look at the numbers of
Yep.
who's leaving or who's getting promoted, right?
Mhm.
There's an underlying system in place that's pushing me out.
People don't usually leave. I mean, I'm not going to say, I say usually. Most of the time, when you have people, especially people of color, when you start seeing a whole bunch of people of color walking out of a space, it's your culture. It's
Yeah.
toxic. It is not just that black people had a cookout one day and said, oh, let's just all leave. That's not what happens.
Right.
It is not, and it's generally not about money. Um, or if it is about money, it may manifest that way. But the issue is not money. The issue may be promotion. You make
Mhm.
more money by going up the ladder and you stay there. And if you don't go up the ladder, you don't make more money. But usually there's not even that. It is generally the culture itself. And so, what kills me is companies know either they don't pay attention to the trends or they
Mhm.
see the trends and say, well, we just don't understand what's going on. Why can't we keep people? Well, you know what? Ask the question. It's your
Mhm.
culture at the end of the day.
Right. And that leads to, so this is why I'm like, oh, I don't want to unpack this whole HR thing. But I think that that's part of the problem, right?
Hmm.
If you have people in these roles that are responsible for culture, but don't understand what culture is, it's never taken an anthropology class to understand what culture is and what makes up culture or understands how subcultures can
Hmm.
create larger cultures and the impacts of that, then when you see these numbers, when you see the statistics, it goes over your head as to what's really happening. And it has to be everything else but culture because
Yeah.
that's what you're responsible for.
And because you don't see, and because unfortunately, if you don't see a problem with culture, it's just like I said, let's do that fish and water thing.
Hmm.
If you are a saltwater fish in a freshwater pond, you can't breathe. But if you're a saltwater fish in the ocean, you don't see a problem. It's
Nope.
the ocean. So everybody should be swimming like this. And if you've never seen a freshwater fish or never had to swim in their ocean or their water to understand it, you don't understand why it's a problem. And so this is where training and
Mhm.
understanding other perspectives, and that you don't get that just by having a conversation with people. Because, like I said, even though inequity manifests and exhibits itself in interpersonal relationships, that is not how it gets fixed. That's not going to
Yeah.
overall fix the problem. You can help people get along all day, but if you don't fix the system, if you don't fix the culture, then those interpersonal relationships are fine, but they're not going to change anything dramatically. And the onus of dealing with it. I mean, what the word we hear now so much is culture of belonging. I personally
Yes.
can't stand that word
Me
because
either.
I hate it. I hate it because
Too.
I did a webinar with a wonderful scientist, Dr. Brian Lowry, who's at Stanford, and we
Mm.
were talking about this. And I said, you know, that word grates my nerves. And he raised a question that I think is very powerful. He says, the question is, to whom does the space belong? If it's not your space, and you tell somebody, I want you to feel a culture of belonging, I can invite you to my house and
Mhm.
if have invite you over for dinner and say, I want you to feel a sense of belonging. But let's say I decide to serve a charcuterie board, which is all pork and all cheese, and you are lactose intolerant and a vegetarian. I can tell you
Mhm.
I want you to belong all day. But if I don't do something to make you feel comfortable in that space, then I don't really
Mhm.
care whether you belong or not. I'm telling you, this is my space and I'm going to let you in it, but I don't really care whether you feel a sense of belonging. If I do care, I'm going to do something different in that space because I own that space. So to me, saying you want to create a culture of belonging, you don't control that. You can't make anybody belong. What you can
Mhm.
do is you can create an inclusive culture
Yes.
that you control. Create that, and then people have the opportunity to feel a sense of belonging. You cannot create that for somebody.
I 110% agree. And
Mm-hmm.
like two things came up for me. One, I was listening back to the episode that we did with Lolita Chandler, who you had
Mm-hmm.
at Cornell. And
Mm-hmm.
she said, there's this phrase of, we want people to be their authentic selves and come to work as their authentic selves. It's just like, whose responsibility is that?
Yeah,
Right? You need to create an environment that allows me to be my authentic self and not feel as if I have to change or have to code switch or do any of those things, right? The onus is on the company and the organization to create that environment. It's not on the employee.
that's why I don't like belonging. Is for the same reason because you put the onus of inclusion on the person who is excluded.
Right.
You put the onus of authenticity on the person who's had to shield their authenticity. That's a real cop out for a company. And it's real easy to say, we don't have to do anything. You
Mm-hmm.
just do what you do. And nobody brings their authentic self to work. Well, put it this way, maybe some people do, but I know people who look like us are not going to bring their authentic selves to work. And that's a shame. But within the realm of what you could truly be authentic as you can be in your workspace, you're right. You have to create a space where people can do that. And you can't
Yes.
just tell them, this is what you got. I own this space, but you bring yourself into it and be authentic. No, that doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
You're right.
And that belonging is really, it's a box, right? You will feel like you belong if you fit into this box.
Exactly. You're
If
right.
you don't do what you need to do to morph and twist your body to fit into this box, then we've done what we created the box.
We created the box. We created a space for you. It's our space. We own it. We did it. Yeah. But come on in. Do what you do. Be
Right.
authentic. No, like I said, if
Does
I'm a
not work.
saltwater, if I'm a freshwater fish in saltwater pond, um, I can want to belong all I want. I'm gonna die.
Yes.
I'm not gonna make it. So yeah,
Yeah.
I agree.
Something else you touched on earlier that I'd written a note about was the use of certain words, right? You're saying like there's no word for anti-racist that's less triggering. And you did a post not too long ago about like what does woke mean,
Mm-hmm.
and the meaning of woke. And so for me, it's like the power of words and how do we know the words that we're using and the meaning behind them? And are we being intentional in using them? And the reason this came up, and I want to talk to you about it, I was looking at another post the other day about a woman that went into a training, And the facilitator said, oh, this is a psychologically safe space.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, you can't just say it's a psychologically safe space. Like, you don't understand the concept of what that is.
Yes,
You
you
can't
don't.
just declare it,
Mm-hmm.
right? You have to create it. You have to build trust. You have to, do all of it. I, as the facilitator, need to do the work in order to make this a safe space, right? A
Exactly.
psychologically safe space. And so I wanted to talk to you about like the importance of words and how, especially now, it's important that practitioners know the meaning of these words, know kind of the foundations of this work before we just throw out terms. Like ally is one that I can't stand, but
Well, the thing
how
about ally
important
is
that is.
you can't call yourself an ally. Somebody
Not at
else gets to
all.
name. You don't get to name yourself an ally. Somebody else doesn't name you that. Yeah, I have difficulty with that one a little bit too. Um, Words are incredible, and I mean that's not just us as communicators saying that because we have a vested interest in it. I'm actually writing a book. I have a co-author. Kim Clark and I are writing a book, and it's called "The Conscious Communicator: The Fine Art of Not Saying Stupid Shit." I mean, as you can see, the mugs, yeah,
I know, I love it.
and because the bottom line is, it is communicators' jobs. It is our job to do this. And when you are in the DEI space or the social justice space, words matter in a way. Words should matter everywhere, but they really matter here because we have an opportunity and a responsibility to move the needle on change. And we do that with the words we use and the words we shape. So if you're in a space where you have that kind of power and you don't work to do it the right way. So the book that we're writing uses a model and it's called the depth model. And
Mhm.
it basically asks you to take the things that you're saying and the words that you're using and how you're communicating and you run them against this model. Depth is an acronym. And it's about being conscious about your communications. So it asks you, when you're writing something and when you're communicating, are you communicating with depth? And
Mm.
the D stands for let me get my words straight here. I always have to look it up actually, believe it or not. Let me make sure I'm saying it correctly. Been looking at you long. Okay. So are you being deliberate? Are you being educated? Are you being
Mhm.
purposeful? Are you being tailored? Are you being habitual? And basically, what it's saying is if you're going to go into this space and have conversations in this space, are you really thinking about what you're doing? And I mean, and as a practitioner, especially. So think about all the companies that when George Floyd was murdered, everybody had the black box.
Mm.
Everybody
Mhm.
says, we stand with you. And then, a month later, they were gone. And it's because they were not communicating with any depth about
Yeah.
what they were doing. And they weren't doing what made sense for their organizations. We can't all be Ben and Jerry's.
Right.
We can't all be that. But you take even a company like Salesforce, which has been known in the industry for being progressive, yet you have two women of color who recently posted their resignation letters on LinkedIn because they said we say this, but we aren't walking the talk. So
Mhm.
that happens so much when you have organizations that have this front. And the reason is some of it is just, being dishonest. There are those
Yeah.
organizations. But I want to give people the benefit of the doubt and say the problem is you have not connected what you say to who you are. And that's why the communication part is so important. That's where we, as communicators,
Mm.
we have a responsibility to call people on it, to say, if we're going to go out in the world and say this about ourselves, what do we have in place? What are we doing? What are the
Mhm.
systems that we have in place that actually make it possible for us to say this? To back up this, to be able to continue saying this, to actually live up to this, to move the needle like we said we're going to do it. What are we most best situated to do? So I think that
Mhm.
we throw words around, and that's why I call myself a diversity pragmatist, because I don't think that this is thoughts and prayers. This is work.
No. Yeah. Yeah.
This is work.
And I use the analogy of Emerald City a lot.
Mm,
I said so many companies operate like Emerald City, right? It's this streets of, gold and this big emerald castle. And, that's the place that everyone wants to be. And then you
mm-hmm.
get there and it's a little man on a bike behind a curtain,
Yep.
right? It's just this facade versus the Garden of Eden where everything is there. It's not perfect, right? But you know that it's not perfect, and you're told that it's not perfect from the beginning,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And you have to make the choices and the decisions on how you're going to navigate that space, right? And so that just came to me just now as, which company do you want to be?
Yeah.
Because so
Yeah.
many of them are Oz. So
Right.
many of
And
them.
the thing is, and when you're talking about doing DEI work, it's never done. You
Never.
don't get it solved. You are always in the process of solving it. You're always doing the work. And that may tire people out, but
Hmm.
it's hard work, but it's ongoing, because no matter what you do, until we become all one of everything and everybody's alike, you're always going to be doing this work. And the question is, are you committed to it for the long game? Are you committed to doing the work all the time? Because you know what? When you own the space, when you own and create the space, you don't have to open that space to anyone else. We hear and we know, we've seen the stats on the value of diversity. Um, Stats notwithstanding, common sense tells us that in an ever changing world, you benefit from having minds that are different, input that's different, different perspectives. But if you're not really willing to build a space where those people can feel open, able, willing to contribute their diversity, if you're not willing to do the work, then don't even bother. I mean, I hate to
Hmm.
say that, but don't, because you're not helping. And if you're not committed to doing the work ongoing, then you're just wasting money. If you just throw, a couple mil to train your company with, we're going to do mandatory unconscious bias training, and then
Oh,
everybody's going to be fine. No, they're not. This, it's ongoing, because you do not solve systemic issues with interpersonal solutions.
right.
You do not. You have to have systemic solutions, and that's ongoing.
Love it. Love it. Love it. So, Janet, I usually ask my guest, what do you do? Right? We're always, and as you were saying just now, this work is constant, right? It's not just a one and done. And
Right.
so we're constantly giving, we're constantly thinking, we're constantly being trying to be creative, right? Push systems and push boundaries in this space, which can be a little exhausting, right? Which can take a lot out of us. So I always ask my guests, like, what do you do to fill yourself up? What do you do to fill your cup? Make sure that you stay somewhat balanced in this space, that you take the time that you need to take for yourself, as you continue to push forward.
I mean, I would love to give you an answer that was great, that somebody could learn from. And I'll say, it's a journey for me. I'm learning. I'm not very good at it, quite honestly. And part of that is because the work always shows up in different places in different ways. I mean, I have a
Mhm.
full-time job within LI, but I also have a consulting firm, Pragmatic Diversity. So there's just the sheer hours of work that you're doing. And I'm writing a book,
Mhm.
so once you step into this space, you're very immersed in it. I know that what I have done in the past is I will eventually hit a wall and just say, stop. And I just stop it all, and walk away from it for a little bit. And in that space, I need to get better at doing it
Mhm.
so that I don't push to that point and walk away. But honestly, what I do is, I cook. That's sort of my downtime. I go in the kitchen and I cook, and without having to have family around to feed all the time, friends get lucky, because so they like, oh, you're having a bad day, what you cooking? And so, and gumbo is a great one, because it takes a long time. There's a lot you got to do. I do that, but I admit that it's hard, because this is one of those spaces when, your first question was, how did I get into it? And I said, I was born into it.
Mhm.
If this is a space that you're born into, and it's a function of who you are, you're doing the work even when you're not doing the work.
Yeah.
So it is very hard to separate from it. And I think we have to be conscious about it. And I know that I should be better about it. But and the more I do it, the many places I'm, the more I'm aware of that. And I'm working on coming up with some strategies that are intentional, because that's what happens a lot. I know for me personally, it's not intentional. I just hit the wall and go, I can't do this right now. I got to
Yeah.
walk away from this and think and find some space. And I need to start being more intentional about it.
The coach in me right now is like, so what would that take? Like, I just want to go ahead and go into that mode. Um, but I think that that's it, right? Like, how do you, or what would it look like if you were to take those moments of hitting the wall, like right before every single day,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
How can you be more intentional of taking that break away every day? I have one client who went on vacation. I was just like, just glowing, talking about this vacation and everything that they did. And I was like, how can you hold on to that every
Hmm.
single day, even if it's for 5 minutes?
Well, I think the other thing is, and this is something that I am seriously kind of coming to the realization is this. Yes, this work is hard work, and
Hmm.
it is often thankless work, and you are often doing it with people who don't want to do the work, and you're fighting, and
Yeah.
that this is not just fun, that this is people's lives that are at stake. I mean, we're not surgeons, we're not saving lives that way, but there's sort of that feel about it that people's lives are at stake. So, and to do that nonstop, I think that one thing we have to look at is that, your client who came back who was glowing, the question I ask is, how did you feel coming back to that work? You brought this glow back, but did you dread going in? Because when you reach the point where pulling away from it,
Hmm.
you feel so much better, you got to ask yourself why. Is
Yeah.
it the work itself, which obviously that would be the case, or is it the place in which you're doing that work? The space that you
Yep.
don't, whose space is it? So I think that some of it is we have to look at where we do this work and who we do and for whom we do this work, and ask
Mhm.
ourselves, is that part of the problem? Because you know what, honestly, not everybody wants to change, and
Right. Exactly.
we have to expend our energy in the places where people truly want to change. And I'll take on the toughest client in the world who has problems and wants to change. I'll deal with the most set in their ways person who doesn't believe anything I'm saying, but is willing to listen and is trying to do this. But the people who don't want to change, if
Yeah.
that's who you're working with, the companies that aren't really serious, if that's who you're working with, I think part of self care is walking away from that.
100% agree. Right.
I'm just too old to be
Yeah.
irritated every day. I'm just, nope. Don't
Yeah.
deal with people. Don't deal with clients and companies. Nope. Mm-mm.
Yeah.
I'll go
It's
spend my
knowing those
energy with the people who
boundaries.
want to change. Right. That's boundaries. It is. I
Yeah.
will go because I'm going to give that same energy to somebody who wants to change, somebody who doesn't for a while. And I have to have so to your point, how do self care? My self care is walking away from crazy stuff.
Hmm.
I walk away, and sometimes it takes me longer than others, but I walk away.
Yeah.
And I think we have to. That's the only way you can keep doing this work. And you don't help if we kill ourselves and get so disillusioned with this work, then we don't help the people who need us. So I think
Yes.
we have to fight that in this space
Yes.
a lot.
And knowing when to walk away. Right.
Hmm.
Janet, thank you so much for
Well,
this,
thank you for having me. I love talking
because
to you.
I know I was just like, oh, we need to do this like every week. Uh, but no, thank you so much, because I think that there's so many pieces of the puzzle of doing this work that we've touched on today. Right. It doesn't have to be, HR. It doesn't have to be, this one thing. It is an amalgamation of things. It's understanding the words. It's
It's
knowing
all
when
of
to
that.
walk away. Right. It's
This is
all
the
of
most
those things.
interdisciplinary space you will ever find yourself in, which means there's room for everybody
Yes.
to do
And
this work.
Janet, if people were to wanted to find you, where could they find you?
Find me on LinkedIn. I am working on the website. I have not had time to pull it up, but on LinkedIn, I'm most active on LinkedIn, and just search my name. I show up, and that's where I do most of my verbalization and communicating with the world. So I'm working on it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Janet. And everyone, thank you so much for being a part of today's show. Hopefully that you picked up some nuggets like I did. I was just taking all kinds of notes with this one. And so be sure to subscribe and make sure that you follow us to get more of this content every single week. So thank you, and we will see you next time.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye bye.